reality of the war on the grounds that Yugoslavia was not a full member of the United Nations at the time when
I know the case when maybe they finally reached that judgment. For several years they were deliberating it. But and that's the sequence. Does any of this get reported? No. You can ask your friends at Princeton. In fact, ask the faculty. They don't know. I mean, these any more than they will know that. I mean, they sort of probably remember the bombing, the capture of the General Hospital at Fallujah. But was there one comment anywhere saying there's a war crime?
What struck me was that you compared the Srebrenica massacre with the Fallujah invasion. Why is that comparison?
I mean, in the case of Srebrenica, the women and children were trucked out, and then came, the massacre. In the case of Fallujah, the women and children were ordered out. They weren't trucked out. They were ordered out, but the men weren't allowed to leave. Then came the attack. In fact, it turned out that the roads out were blocked. Well, I mean, the whole thing isn't, it's not the same story, but that part is similar. I actually mentioned that a couple of times. Storm of protest, hysteria. Incidentally, this Guardian affair, part of it, which was total fraud, on the part of the editors, not the reporter. They blamed it on the reporter, but it was the editors. One of the things that they were infuriated about was that she asked me, what about the thin men and the behind the barbed wire? Isn't that a horrible atrocity? And I said, well, it's not certain that it was correct. Okay, that led to a hysteria. That's when Philip Knightley tried to intervene to present once again his analysis and once again his critique of the media, but couldn't. And he's a very prominent, prestigious person. You just cannot break ranks. That's not tolerated. I mean, we're lucky. We don't have censorship. It's a free society. But the self-censorship is overwhelming. Actually, Orwell once wrote about this in something that nobody's read. Everyone has read Animal Farm. Almost nobody's read the introduction to Animal Farm. Unpublished. Came out as unpublished papers 30 years later. In it, what he said is Animal Farm's a satire of this totalitarian state. He said free England is not very different. In free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. He gave some examples. It's very similar here. And it doesn't matter how extreme they are. I mean, the Iraq invasion is a perfect example. You cannot find anywhere in the mainstream a suggestion that it's wrong to invade another country. That if you invade another country, you have to pay reparations, you have to withdraw, and the leadership has to be punished. I mean, I don't know if you ever read the Nuremberg judgments, but after the Nuremberg judgments, Justice Jackson, the chief of counsel for the prosecution, U.S. Justice, made a very, very eloquent statement about how we're sentencing these people to death. The crimes for which they committed are crimes when anybody commits them, including when we commit them. We have to live up to that. He said, we are handing the defendants a poisoned chalice. And if we sip from this poisoned chalice, we must be treated the same way. Can't be more explicit. They also defined aggression. Aggression was defined in terms which just apply absolutely and without exception, not only to the invasion of Iraq, but to all sorts of other invasions in Vietnam and many others. Actually, even the terrorist war against Nicaragua technically falls under the crime of aggression as defined at Nuremberg.
Does the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia?
That's not even questioned. In fact, there was a so-called independent commission of inquiry on the Kosovo bombing led by a very respected South African jurist, Justice Goldstone. And they concluded that the bombing was, in their words, illegal but legitimate. Okay, illegal makes it a war crime. But they said it was legitimate because it was necessary to stop genocide. And then comes the usual inversion of the history. Actually, Justice Goldstone, who is a respectable person, later recognized that the atrocities came after the bombing. And that they were furthermore the anticipated consequence of the bombing. He recognized that. in a lecture, Morgenthau lecture in New York a couple of years ago. He said, well, nevertheless, we can take some comfort in the fact that Serbia was planning it anyway. And the proof that they were planning it is, guess what? Operation Horseshoe. A probable intelligence fabrication that was publicized after the bombing. So even if it was true, it wouldn't matter. And furthermore, even if it was true, it was a contingency plan. I mean, look, Israel has contingency plans to drive all the Palestinians out of the West Bank if there's a conflict. Does that mean that Iran has a right to bomb Israel? The U.S. has contingency plans to invade Canada. Okay, does that mean everybody has a right to bomb the United States? I mean, that's the last straw of justification on the part of a respectable person. But for the herd of independent minds, it just doesn't matter. The bombing was because of our high values and our nobility, and it was to stop genocide. You say anything else, torrent of vilification and abuse comes. But it's not just on this issue. It's on every issue. So try to bring up the idea. Take, say, the Vietnam War. A lot of time has passed. A huge amount of scholarship, tons of documentation, blew up the country.
Let me just, I'm sorry, we won't have time for going into that. I want to ask you about some of the present developments that are being used again to fabricate a lot of these issues. Slobodan Milošević died last month. What is the significance of his death in your view?
Milošević was committed many crimes. Not a nice person, terrible person. But the charges against him would never have held up. He was originally indicted on the Kosovo charges. The indictment was issued right in the middle of the bombing, which already nullifies it. They admittedly used British and U.S. intelligence. It was right in the middle of the bombing. Can't possibly take seriously. However, if you look at the indictment, it was for crimes committed after the bombing. There's one exception, Racek. Well, let's even grant that the claims are true. Let's put it aside. All right, so there was one exception, no evidence that he was involved or what took place, but almost the entire indictment was for after the bombing. How are those charges going to stand up unless you put Bill Clinton and Tony Blair on the dock alongside him? All right, then they realized that was a weak case, so they added the early Balkan wars. Okay, a lot of horrible things happened. But the worst crime, the one that they're really going to charge him with genocide, is Srebrenica. There's a little problem with that. Namely, there was an extensive, detailed inquiry into it by the Dutch government, which was the responsible government. There were Dutch forces there. That's a big, hundreds of pages of inquiry. And their conclusion is that Milošević didn't know anything about it. And that when it was discovered in Belgrade, they were horrified. Well, suppose that had entered into testimony.
Does this mean that you were a Milošević sympathizer?
No, I thought it was terrible. I thought he should have been thrown out. In fact, he probably would have been thrown out in the early 90s if the Albanians had voted. It's pretty close. Yeah, he did all sorts of terrible things, but it wasn't a totalitarian state. I mean, there were elections, there was an opposition, a lot of rotten things everywhere. And I certainly wouldn't want to have dinner with him or talk to him. And yes, he deserves to be tried for crimes, but this trial was never going to hold up if it was even semi-honest. It was a farce. In fact, they were lucky that he died.
In what sense?
Because they didn't have to go through with the trial. Now you can build up an image about how he would have been convicted as another Hitler, and we don't have to do it.
I just want to bring you back to the bombing of RTS. Some have argued that this particular act of NATO's 99 set precedents for targeting of media by the United States afterward, notably in Afghanistan and Iraq. That is, that it set a precedent for legitimizing media houses and labeling them as propaganda in order to bomb them in U.S. invasions. Do you make any connection there?
Well, I mean, the chronology is correct, but I don't think they need excuses. The point is, you bomb anybody you want to. Let's take 1998, so it's before it. In 1998, here's another thing.